She was an ordinary woman, the kind of person most people passed by without noticing. In her small town, she lived a simple life that never drew attention. She dressed plainly, spoke softly, and never tried to be the center of any conversation. For many people, she was just that quiet woman, the one who always smiled politely and carried herself with modesty. No one thought there was anything unusual about her. They saw only her calm face, her worn clothes, and her quiet way of walking. To them, she seemed ordinary, maybe even a little dull. But what they did not know was that behind her silence lived a world full of feelings and dreams. Her days began early, often with the sound of birds outside her small window. She lived in a modest house on the edge of town, where flowers grew in the front yard and the smell of fresh bread sometimes came from her kitchen. She was not wealthy, and she did not have many luxuries, but she carried herself with dignity. Every morning she would go about her chores, sweeping the floor, tending to her garden, and preparing meals with care. People often saw her walking to the market, carrying a basket with vegetables, always greeting others with kindness. Though she was gentle, she was also strong in her own quiet way. In the town, people often talked about each other, as small towns usually do. They spoke of families, work, and who was achieving what. But rarely did her name come up. She was not known for great success, nor for any failure. She seemed invisible to many, a background figure in the lives of others. If someone asked about her, people would shrug and say, "Oh, she's just simple, nothing special." Yet, in her heart, she carried a secret love that she never shared openly. She loved music more deeply than anyone could imagine. When she was younger, she had discovered the beauty of sound. She remembered hearing a piano for the very first time when she was a child. It was during a festival in the town square. The rich family who lived in the large house had brought in a pianist to play, and the melodies floated through the air like magic. As a little girl, she had stood in the crowd, her eyes wide, her heart pounding with wonder. The sound was unlike anything she had ever heard before. She felt as though the music had entered her soul and awakened something inside her. From that moment, she dreamed of playing. She did not have a piano, and her family could not afford lessons, but her curiosity never left her. Whenever she passed by the big house in town, where a piano sometimes could be heard, she would stop for a moment and listen. She memorized the tunes, humming them as she walked home. At night, when the world was quiet, she would close her eyes and imagine her fingers moving over the keys, pressing them one by one, making music of her own. As she grew older, life became busy. She had to work hard to take care of herself. Responsibilities filled her days, and the dream of music seemed too far away to reach. Still, she never forgot it. Whenever she had time, she found small ways to keep her passion alive. Sometimes she would use an old wooden table in her house, pretending it was a piano, tapping lightly with her fingers. Other times she would hum tunes while cooking, letting her imagination bring the melodies back to life. Though no one knew it, music was her secret companion, the hidden part of her that made her feel alive. In her town, people valued those who showed off their talents. If someone could sing well, they were invited to perform at gatherings. If someone danced beautifully, people admired them and praised their skill. But because she never showed her love for music, people assumed she had no talent. To them, she was simply a quiet woman who worked hard and minded her own business. They never thought she could be capable of something extraordinary. There were times when she wondered if maybe everyone else was right. Perhaps she really was just simple. Perhaps her love for music was only a childish dream. Yet, whenever she was alone, she could not stop herself from imagining melodies. Her heart would beat in rhythm to the tunes she carried within her, and she knew, deep down, that her passion was real. She often attended community gatherings, where laughter filled the air and people shared stories. At these gatherings, there was sometimes a piano in the corner, shining and untouched, waiting for someone bold enough to sit and play. She never dared to go near it, because she knew people would laugh if she tried. She did not want to embarrass herself in front of others. Instead, she sat quietly, clapping politely when others performed, her secret desire hidden behind her smile. Life carried on in this way for many years. People continued to see her as ordinary, never realizing the fire she carried inside. She never complained, never tried to correct them, and never asked for recognition. She believed that life was not about showing off, but about living with kindness and humility. And so, she continued her routine, waking early, working hard, helping others when she could, and always keeping her quiet dream tucked away in her heart. Little did anyone know, life was preparing a moment for her. A moment that would test her courage. A moment when she would no longer be able to hide. For now, she remained unseen, a simple woman in the eyes of her neighbors. But time has a way of revealing what is hidden. And soon, everyone in her town would discover that the woman they thought was ordinary was anything but ordinary at all. The day that would change everything for her began like any other. She woke up early, did her morning chores, and prepared for the evening gathering that the townspeople were hosting. It was a common tradition in their small town to gather together for celebrations, birthdays, or just to enjoy music and food. These gatherings were always lively, filled with laughter, chatter, and sometimes even a little gossip. She usually attended because it was expected, though she never liked being the center of attention. She preferred to sit quietly in a corner, listening to others and smiling when spoken to. On this particular evening, the gathering was held in one of the largest homes in town. It belonged to a wealthy family who loved to show off their fine furniture, expensive dishes, and most of all, their grand piano. The piano was placed in the middle of the hall, polished until it gleamed under the light of the chandeliers. Guests often admired it, though very few ever played it. Only those who had training or confidence dared to touch its keys. She walked into the house, wearing her simple dress, holding a small dish of food she had prepared to share. She greeted a few neighbors politely and took her usual quiet seat near the back of the room. As she sat there, she noticed the laughter and energy in the hall. People were eating, drinking, and chatting about all sorts of things. Some were boasting about their children, others were sharing funny stories, and a few were waiting eagerly to see who might entertain them that night. After some time, the host of the evening encouraged people to come forward and perform. "Does anyone want to sing a song? Maybe play something for us," he asked with a wide smile. A few children sang cheerful songs, and a young man recited a poem. The guests clapped politely. But soon, the energy in the room began to fade. People wanted something more exciting. It was then that a small group of people, who often liked to tease others, began whispering among themselves. Their eyes turned toward her, the quiet woman sitting alone. They smiled at each other mischievously, as though they had found a way to bring some amusement to the gathering. One of them stood up and loudly said, "Why don't we ask her to play something on the piano?" The suggestion brought laughter from those who were nearby. Everyone knew she was not known for any talent. To them, she was just a simple woman who kept to herself. Surely, she could not play an instrument as grand as the piano. The idea itself seemed funny, almost ridiculous. A few voices joined in, clapping and calling her name, insisting that she come forward. She froze in her seat, her face turning pale. She shook her head politely, giving a small smile as if to refuse. But the group of people continued, their voices growing louder, pushing her to the center of attention. "Come on, don't be shy," one of them laughed. Another added, "It will be fun. We all want to hear you play." The laughter in the room grew, and soon others joined in, not out of unkindness, but because they thought it was harmless entertainment. They did not realize how uncomfortable she felt. She tried to say no again, but the voices around her only pressed harder. People clapped their hands on the tables, chanting her name. Even the host encouraged her gently, saying, "Just play a few notes. Everyone will enjoy it." Her heart began to race. She felt trapped. She had always kept her love for music hidden, and now she was being forced into the spotlight in the worst way possible. They did not ask her because they believed in her talent, they asked her because they wanted to see her fail. They wanted to laugh at her awkwardness, to turn her into the evening's joke. Slowly, almost against her will, she stood up. Her hands trembled as she walked through the room, feeling dozens of eyes on her. Whispers followed her steps, and she could hear people giggling softly behind their hands. She kept her head slightly lowered, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. When she reached the piano, she stood still for a moment, staring at the polished keys. The crowd settled, waiting eagerly. Some leaned forward in their chairs, curious to see what would happen. A few already began whispering bets on how long it would take before she gave up. She could hear faint laughter, though no one spoke too loudly now that she was standing in front of the piano. Her mind raced. She wanted to turn back, to run to her seat, to escape the heavy weight of expectation pressing on her. But something deep inside her stopped her. For years, she had kept her passion locked away, too afraid to show it. Now, even though she was being mocked, the piano sat right in front of her, waiting. It was the very instrument she had dreamed of touching since childhood. The thought struck her, perhaps this was her only chance. Her trembling hand slowly reached out, hovering above the keys. For a moment, she could not bring herself to touch them. She could still hear the faint chuckles of those who expected her to fumble. Her heart beat so loudly that she thought everyone in the room could hear it. She closed her eyes, trying to calm herself. Then, with a deep breath, she pressed a single key. A clear sound rang through the hall. It was simple, but it was enough to silence the whispers. Encouraged, she pressed another, then another, forming a small melody. Her body shook, but as the notes began to connect, something shifted within her. The piano was no longer a stranger, it felt like home. Her fingers, though hesitant at first, started moving more naturally. The laughter that had filled the room moments earlier faded into silence. No one expected her to produce even the smallest tune, yet here she was, creating music. The crowd leaned closer, watching in disbelief. The group that had pushed her onto the stage exchanged confused glances. This was not what they had planned. They had wanted a joke, but now they were witnessing something entirely different. She continued to play, letting her heart guide her fingers. The music that had lived inside her for so many years finally found a voice. She was no longer aware of the crowd, the whispers, or the mocking smiles. She was lost in the sound, carried away by the rhythm and melody flowing from her hands. The room remained silent, the air heavy with surprise. Everyone listened, captivated. For the first time in her life, she was not invisible. All eyes were on her, not in mockery, but in awe. Her fingers moved carefully across the keys, each note filling the room with a quiet beauty that no one had expected. At first, the melody was soft and uncertain, like a whisper trying to find its voice. But slowly, her confidence began to grow. The more she played, the steadier her hands became. The piano, which had once seemed like an untouchable dream, now felt natural under her touch. It was as if her hands had been waiting their whole life for this moment. The guests leaned forward in their chairs, holding their breath without even realizing it. The same people who had laughed only minutes before now sat in silence, their faces reflecting a mixture of surprise and wonder. Every key she pressed seemed to reveal something hidden, something they had never known about her. She closed her eyes for a moment, forgetting about the crowd. Her heart poured into the music, each note carrying pieces of her soul. She thought of the nights she had pretended to play on her old wooden table, the countless times she had hummed tunes while cooking or sweeping. All of those secret moments had built up to this one. Now, the melodies that had lived only inside her imagination were finally alive in the open air. The room grew so quiet that the only sound was the piano. Even the clinking of glasses, the shifting of chairs, and the whispers had stopped. People who had been ready to laugh at her failure now sat frozen, their eyes locked on her moving fingers. Some even forgot to blink. She played with a depth that came not from formal lessons, but from years of love. Each note carried emotion: joy, sadness, longing, and hope. It was music born from a heart that had suffered quietly yet held on to its dreams. That was why it touched everyone so deeply. They did not just hear the notes, they felt them. As the melody grew stronger, the atmosphere in the room began to change. People who had once looked at her as nothing more than a simple woman now saw her in a new light. She was no longer invisible. She was commanding the attention of every single person there, not by force, but by the undeniable beauty of her music. Among the crowd, some people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. These were the ones who had pushed her forward, who had wanted to see her embarrassed. Now, they felt a sting of shame as they realized what they had done. Their laughter seemed cruel in their own memories. They had underestimated her, mocked her, and yet here she was, proving them wrong without saying a single word. She kept playing, her body swaying slightly with the rhythm. The melody rose higher, then softened again, like waves rolling gently across the shore. Her face showed calm, but her eyes glistened with quiet emotion. To her, this was not about showing off or seeking applause. It was about finally letting out the music that had been locked in her heart for so long. The grand piano, polished and elegant, had always been a symbol of wealth and power in the town. It belonged to the rich, the educated, the confident. Yet in that moment, it belonged to her. She made it sing in a way that even the most practiced musicians might not have. She had no sheet music, no teacher's guidance, only the pure force of her passion. And that passion was enough to fill the entire hall with something unforgettable. One by one, people began to feel the music in their own hearts. A woman in the crowd wiped away tears without realizing it. A man who had been laughing earlier now sat still, his face serious, almost regretful. The children, who were usually restless during such gatherings, sat quietly, their wide eyes fixed on her hands. Even the host, who had encouraged her only to keep the crowd entertained, looked at her with admiration, his earlier casual smile replaced by respect. She continued to play, weaving together melodies that told her story. The notes spoke of her lonely nights, her quiet struggles, her hidden joys. They carried the weight of her silence, the strength of her patience, and the beauty of her dreams. Though she had never spoken of these things to anyone, the music told it all. For the first time in her life, she felt truly free. She was not worried about how she looked, or about the whispers around her. She was not the simple woman everyone thought she was. She was herself, fully and completely, and the music was her voice. The audience could sense this. That was why they could not look away. They realized that talent does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it hides quietly, waiting for the right moment to bloom. And when it does, it shocks the world. The melody reached a point where it grew stronger, more powerful, almost like a storm. Her fingers moved faster, creating a rich harmony that filled every corner of the hall. The sound rose higher and higher, carrying everyone's emotions with it. Just when it seemed the music could not climb any further, she softened it again, letting it drift gently like a breeze. The sudden calmness made the listeners lean in even closer, afraid to miss a single note. She was lost in the music now, so deeply that she forgot the fear she had felt earlier. She forgot the mocking voices, the laughter, the pressure. All that remained was the piano and her soul pouring into it. The music was no longer just hers, it belonged to everyone in that room. When at last the piece came to its natural end, she let her hands rest lightly on the keys. The final note lingered in the air, fading slowly until silence returned. But it was not the same silence as before. This silence was heavy, filled with awe. No one dared to speak or move. It was as if the entire room was still wrapped in the magic of her music. Her chest rose and fell as she caught her breath. She opened her eyes, half afraid of what she might see. Would they laugh again? Would they clap politely only out of courtesy? But when she looked around, she saw something she had never seen before. Every single person was staring at her with wide eyes, their expressions filled with admiration. The quiet stretched on for a moment longer, and then suddenly the room erupted into applause. It was not the polite kind of applause given out of habit. It was loud, heartfelt, and filled with genuine respect. People stood to their feet, clapping and cheering. Some even shouted her name. The sound of their approval echoed through the hall, stronger than she had ever imagined. She sat there for a moment, overwhelmed. She had not played for applause. She had played because she could no longer keep her music hidden. But now, seeing the reaction of the crowd, she felt something warm inside her chest. For years, people had overlooked her, but in that single evening, she had shown them a side of herself they never expected. The very people who had forced her to the piano to mock her were now clapping the loudest, their faces red with shame and surprise. They tried to smile, but she could see the guilt in their eyes. And though she did not hold anger in her heart, she knew they had learned a lesson they would not forget. She gave a small bow, her lips curving into a shy smile. She was not proud in a boastful way, but she was at peace. At last, she had been heard. At last, her hidden talent was no longer hidden. The sound of applause still rang in the room, echoing against the walls long after her fingers had left the keys. She sat there quietly, her hands folded on her lap, not quite knowing what to do. She had never expected such a reaction. Her heart was still racing, but this time it was not from fear, it was from a strange mixture of relief and disbelief. For so long she had hidden this part of herself, and now it stood bare before everyone, shining in a way she never thought possible. People in the crowd looked at one another, their faces filled with astonishment. Only moments earlier, they had thought of her as someone plain and unremarkable, a woman who blended into the background of life. But now they saw her in an entirely new way. It was as though the music had opened a curtain, revealing a brilliance that had always been there but never noticed. Some guests whispered softly, not out of mockery, but because they were trying to make sense of what they had just experienced. One woman leaned toward her neighbor and said, "How could we not know she could play like that?" Another shook his head in disbelief, replying, "I never imagined she had such talent." Their words were filled with regret, because they realized they had judged her unfairly for years. Among the crowd, the small group of people who had pushed her forward sat uncomfortably in their seats. They had wanted to see her stumble, to laugh at her, to make her the evening's entertainment. But now, they were left red-faced, ashamed of their cruelty. Their laughter had been replaced with silence, and they could not even look her in the eye. They clapped loudly, trying to cover their guilt with applause, but deep inside they knew they had been wrong. She rose slowly from the piano bench and gave a small bow. The guests continued clapping, some even standing to show their respect. A few reached out as she walked past, touching her arm gently, their faces glowing with admiration. For the first time in her life, she felt truly seen. It was as if the years of invisibility had been washed away in a single evening. As she returned to her seat, people rushed to speak with her. A woman came forward, eyes shining, and said, "That was the most beautiful music I've ever heard. You touched my heart." Another man added, "You play with such emotion. Where did you learn?" She smiled shyly and shook her head, whispering that she had never learned formally, that it was only something she loved. Her honesty left them even more amazed. The gathering that evening changed completely. Before she played, the mood had been casual, filled with small talk and laughter. Now, the entire hall seemed to carry a new kind of energy, quieter, deeper, more respectful. People no longer saw her as background. They looked at her with admiration, some even with awe, as if she had transformed before their very eyes. Children ran up to her, tugging gently at her dress, asking if she would play again. She laughed softly, touched by their innocent excitement, but shook her head. One performance had already taken more courage than she thought she had. She promised them gently, another time. Their smiles were enough to make her heart glow. The host of the evening approached her with a wide smile, shaking her hand warmly. "You have given us a gift tonight," he said sincerely. "We had no idea we were sitting among such talent." His words made her blush, and she lowered her eyes, unused to such praise. But inside, she felt a quiet joy she could not deny. As the evening continued, the conversations changed. People no longer talked about gossip or trivial matters. Instead, they spoke about her performance, replaying the beauty of it in their minds. Some compared it to professional musicians they had heard in larger cities, saying her music carried more emotion than any polished concert. Others wondered how someone could hide such brilliance for so long. The group who had mocked her earlier stayed silent, their laughter gone. A few of them finally gathered the courage to approach her, offering apologies cloaked in compliments. "You surprised us all," one of them admitted awkwardly. She only smiled gently, not holding any bitterness. She was not the kind of person to carry anger. For her, the music had already washed away the sting of their mockery. In the corner of the hall, an elderly man who had once been a music teacher sat with tears in his eyes. He had taught piano to wealthy children many years ago, but he had rarely heard such raw emotion in music. He approached her quietly and said, "Child, you have a gift that comes from the soul. No training could have given you what you have. Never stop playing." His words touched her deeply, and she bowed her head in gratitude. The night went on, but the memory of her performance lingered in every conversation, in every glance. People who had never spoken much to her before now came to her with respect, eager to know more about her life. They asked questions about her childhood, her interests, her days. For once, she was not invisible. She was at the heart of the gathering, and everyone wanted to be near her. She sat quietly, responding humbly, her smile soft but genuine. She did not boast about her talent. She did not speak of it as though it made her better than anyone else. She simply shared that music had always been her comfort, her secret companion through life. The simplicity of her words made people admire her even more. As the guests began to leave later that night, many of them looked back at her with warm smiles, promising to invite her to future gatherings. Some even suggested she should perform in larger events, to let more people hear her music. She only nodded shyly, unsure if she was ready for such things, but grateful that they believed in her. When the house finally grew quiet and the last guest had left, she walked home under the night sky. The stars above seemed brighter than ever. Each step she took felt lighter, as though a heavy weight had been lifted from her shoulders. For years, she had carried her love for music silently, afraid of judgment. But now, the world had heard her voice, and it had not laughed, it had listened. That night, as she lay in bed, she replayed the entire evening in her mind. She remembered the fear, the trembling in her hands, the sound of the first note. She remembered the silence that fell over the room, the way the crowd's faces had changed as she played. And finally, she remembered the applause, the sound of respect, of recognition, of acceptance. For the first time in a long while, she drifted into sleep with a smile on her face. The world that had once overlooked her now saw her differently. She had not sought fame or attention. All she had wanted was to let her music breathe. And in doing so, she had transformed not only how others saw her, but also how she saw herself. The simple woman the town had always ignored had become, in one evening, the heart of their admiration. The same piano that had once been placed in the hall for decoration had become the stage where her hidden soul was finally revealed. And though she did not know it yet, this was only the beginning. The next morning, the town seemed different to her, though everything looked the same. The streets were still narrow, the market was still crowded with people selling vegetables and bread, and the same children still played near the fountain. But the way people looked at her had changed. Wherever she went, neighbors greeted her warmly, their smiles filled with respect. Some stopped her in the street, praising her performance from the night before. Others simply nodded at her with admiration, as if they had discovered a hidden treasure in their midst. She felt shy under all the attention, but also strangely happy. For so many years, she had walked through the town unnoticed, her presence barely acknowledged. Now, people looked at her as though she had always been extraordinary. Yet deep inside, she reminded herself that nothing about her had changed. She was still the same woman, living the same simple life. What had changed was that others finally saw her truth. As days passed, the story of that night spread quickly. Word traveled beyond the gathering. People who had not even been present heard about the simple woman who played the piano like an angel. At the market, shopkeepers asked her if she would play again at the next event. Children whispered her name with excitement, telling their friends how beautifully she had played. Even people from nearby towns began to hear about her talent, carried by those who had witnessed it firsthand. The group who had mocked her at the gathering avoided her for a while, too embarrassed to face her. But eventually, some of them came to her and spoke softly, saying they were sorry for how they had treated her. She listened to their apologies with patience, not holding grudges. She simply nodded and smiled, for her heart was gentle. She had never sought revenge. The music itself had been her answer, and it had spoken louder than any words she could have used. One evening, she was invited again to another gathering. This time, the request for her to play was not made in mockery. It was made with genuine anticipation. People asked her kindly, waiting with respect instead of laughter. She hesitated at first, nervous as always, but when she placed her hands on the piano, she felt the same peace as before. The music flowed again, and once more, the room grew silent in awe. Unlike the first time, she now played without fear. She was not proving herself to anyone anymore. She was simply sharing what had always been inside her. And because of that, her music felt even more powerful. Listeners closed their eyes, letting the melodies carry them away. When she finished, the applause was even louder than before. Her life began to change in small but meaningful ways. She was invited to more events, asked to play at celebrations, and even requested to teach children who dreamed of learning. At first, she was unsure. She had never been trained formally and thought she was unworthy of being a teacher. But the parents insisted, saying that what mattered was her heart and the way she made music feel alive. Slowly, she agreed, and soon children would gather around her, learning not just to press the right keys, but to feel the music deeply, as she did. In teaching others, she discovered a new joy. She saw the same spark in the eyes of children that she had once carried in her heart as a little girl listening to a distant piano. She encouraged them gently, reminding them that music was not about perfection, but about expression. Under her guidance, the children learned not only to play notes, but to tell stories through sound. The town grew proud of her. She was no longer spoken of as the simple woman. Instead, she was called the woman with music in her soul. People respected her for her humility, her kindness, and her extraordinary gift. Visitors who came to the town often heard about her and asked to listen. Some even brought small gifts as tokens of appreciation. She accepted them with gratitude, though she never asked for anything in return. Despite all the admiration, she remained the same at heart. She still lived in her modest home, tended to her garden, and walked to the market with her small basket. She still greeted everyone with the same gentle smile. Fame did not change her, because she had never desired it. All she wanted was to share the music that had once been her secret. Over time, the memory of that first night at the gathering became a story often retold. Parents told their children about it, reminding them not to judge others too quickly, because everyone carries hidden gifts. People spoke of how they had once laughed, but ended up clapping with tears in their eyes. Her story became a lesson for the town: never underestimate someone simply because they seem ordinary. For her, the greatest change was within herself. For years, she had doubted her worth, believing that her love for music was only a dream. Now, she knew it was real. She had found the courage to share it, and in doing so, she discovered her true self. She no longer saw herself as invisible. She realized that simplicity was not weakness. Simplicity could carry greatness within it, waiting for the right moment to shine. On quiet nights, when she sat by her window listening to the wind rustling through the trees, she often thought about how life had unfolded. She wondered how different things might have been if she had never been pushed toward that piano in mockery. At first, she had felt humiliated, cornered, forced into a situation she did not want. But now, she saw it differently. That moment had been the doorway through which her hidden world had stepped into the light. What was meant to embarrass her had instead revealed her strength. Sometimes, when she walked by the same wealthy house where she had first played, she paused and smiled. The piano inside no longer represented fear or mockery. To her, it was the beginning of her freedom. It had given her the chance to finally be heard, to let her soul speak. Years later, when people looked back on that evening, they remembered it not just as a night of music, but as a turning point for their entire community. It had taught them to look deeper, to value kindness, and to respect the unseen talents in everyone. And at the center of that memory was her once unnoticed, now unforgettable. She never sought grand stages or fame beyond her town. That was not who she was. She found happiness in sharing her gift with the people around her, in teaching children, in seeing the way music brought peace to hearts. Her life remained simple, but it was no longer ordinary. It was full of meaning. And so, the woman who had once been mocked became the woman everyone admired. The music that had once been a secret became her strength, her voice, her story. She had taught the world around her something important: never judge a book by its cover, because sometimes the quietest person carries the loudest song.